right, the Koreans, I'm talking about the North Koreans and the South Koreans trying to box the United States out. The South Korean leader looking forward to talk to Kim Jong-un, who was saying over the weekend that nuclear button is always on his desk. But if these guys talk, then we're kind of in the odd position to wait them out. Let's talk to Nuclear Showdown best-selling author Gordon Chang on what happens now. Gordon, what do you think?
Well, Kim Jong-un is trying to do two things. First of all, with that comment about the nuclear buttons always on his desk, that's saying to the United States, don't attack me. And I think that Kim Jong-un has actually become a little bit unnerved by some of the comments in Washington about a first strike on the North. Now, with regard to his comments to South Korea, these are really important because he's trying to divide, put a wedge between Seoul and Washington. That's a long-term goal of the Kim regime. What he wants to do is to get the South Koreans to invest in North Korea, to give them aid, to drop sanctions, to do all the things which run counter to what President Trump is trying to do, which is to deny resources to Kim so he can't launch missiles or detonate nukes.
But then we can't do anything, certainly unilaterally, if the South Koreans are going through with talks with the North Koreans or further, inviting them to participate in the Olympic Games. Lindsey Graham, as I'm sure you're aware, Gordon, has said that that would be a big mistake. That the U.S. should not participate in the games themselves if athletes from North Korea did. What do you think?
No, I don't think that we are at the point where we have to boycott the Olympics. This is not the invasion of Afghanistan where President Carter didn't send our team to Moscow. But, you know, there's all sorts of things that we can do to prevent the South Koreans from doing things which undercut our positions. So, for instance, we can remind the South Koreans, for instance, that a lot of what Kim Jong-un wants them to do violates UN sanctions. Also, we've got our trade negotiations with the South Koreans over the free trade agreement. There are a number of predatory actions that South Korea has taken towards U.S. companies like Qualcomm. There's all sorts of ways that we can resolve these, some of them harsh, some of them not so harsh. But I think that President Moon Jae-in of South Korea needs to understand that the U.S. is going to use economic leverage over South Korea.
You know this so well, Gordon. I always think that if you think of the position of the South Koreans, they've got these big Olympic Games. They paid north of $1 billion to host them. They don't want anything to get in the way of that. So can understand why they're in this kind of desperate position. Please don't screw this up for us, Kim Jong-un. But how far can we let them go?
Well, you know, two ice skaters from North Korea going to the Winter Olympics is not really going to hurt us. So I don't think that that's going to be something that we're going to be doing. But there are a lot of things that we can do right now. And so we should be going after North Korea's sponsors, China and Russia. We haven't been willing to do that. You got a lot of people talking about going to war with North Korea, forgetting, by the way, that China might come in on North Korea's side, as Beijing said it would do. But there's a lot of things that we can do to get the Chinese to back away from North Korea. And we have done very little in that regard. So, of course, you know, there's a lot of things that we can do short of the use of force to disarm North Korea. And they're already hurting from sanctions, as President Trump mentioned in his tweet.
Well, they're finding ways around them, right? I mean, you had heard these ships that are stopped in South Korea from parts unknown. Maybe you know those parts, but that people are finding ways to get stuff to North Korea. How do we deal with that?
Well, there are a couple of ways. One of them is that because North Korea has abrogated the armistice, you know, we should be saying to the North Koreans, to the Chinese, we're just going to park our ships outside of North Korean ports, prevent them from selling weapons around the world. You know, this is going to be very difficult. It's not something that we want to do, but we cannot allow the North Koreans to sell their most advanced missiles to the Iranians, which we've been permitting, and we've been permitting over the course of decades. So this is an issue of America's not willing to defend our interests, not willing to protect our allies. Yeah, it's going to be difficult blockading North Korean ports, but this is something we absolutely have to do unless we want to go to war, which I think is going to be so much worse than a blockade of North Korea.
You know what I worry about, Gordon, I mean, and maybe find books like your own on the region, kind of put it in context, that I don't worry necessarily about war with North Korea, but a very real Cold War, economic war with the Chinese that might have far more significant long-term repercussions. What do you think?
Yeah, but we're already in one of those, Neil,
well,
because, you know, you have China over the rule of Xi Jinping engaging in especially predatory trade practices, not only discriminatory law enforcement on antitrust and other things, but also you have now formal regulations and rules which are basically have the purpose and have the effect of going after foreign competitors and not local ones. And there's just been a whole raft of subsidy programs that, for instance, the Made in China 2025 program, those are all hurting U.S. companies and certainly benefiting local ones. You know, I don't know why we're putting up with that. And then, of course, there's the theft of U.S. intellectual property, $400 billion a year.
Gordon, real fast, so during the Olympics, let's say the North Koreans launch a missile, like all their other tests of late. Right in the middle of the Olympics, our athletes are there, the world's athletes are there in South Korea. What do we do?
Depends what that missile is. If we think that there's a thermonuclear warhead on it, this is one of those times when we might want to test our missile defense, especially our Aegis destroyers off of the North Korean coast. If it's a regular run-of-the-mill missile test, we think, then we very well may let it go and use that to put more pressure on the North Koreans. At some point, we have got to stop these North Korean missile tests. And we're allowing the Chinese to sell technology, as it was indicated in that Washington Free Beacon report today.
Right.
So, we've got to stop it.
South Korean authorities have seized a second ship they suspect of violating international sanctions by supplying oil to North Korea. Recently, tough UN sanctions were imposed, banning nearly all of North Korea's oil imports in an attempt to curb ballistic missile tests. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has called on all nations to clamp down on the rogue regime, saying the U.S. has a right to, quote, interdict maritime traffic. But should the U.S. lead an actual blockade of North Korea? Some experts are saying that is a solution to bringing Pyongyang to heel, as it displays a new so-called nuclear button and yet another threat. Joining me now to discuss, former Green Beret and Fox News contributor Michael Wall. It's great to see you tonight.
Thanks, Shannon.
Okay, so I want to start by a piece that was an opinion piece on FoxNews.com from a retired lieutenant commander from the Navy, Gregory Keeley. He says this, short of a naval blockade where every ship in the vicinity of North Korea is boarded, searched, and if necessary, impounded, it will be impossible to entirely close the oil lifeline spigot. Is it a realistic solution to this issue?
Well, big picture, President Trump must consider, and this is an important part of it, every option on the table short of the military option, because so much is at stake there. So what would a naval blockade, seek to accomplish? Well, basically two things. One, to stop the inflow coming into North Korea of oil and gas and anything that could benefit its nuclear program, the machinery or any raw materials, and then the export, in particular with North Korea, of its textiles and seafood, where it gets a lot of hard currency. But operationally, it would be incredibly tough. It would seriously tie down our Pacific Fleet, specifically the 7th Fleet based out of Japan, and it's the 7th Fleet that already lost 2 ships this year, the McCain and the Fitzgerald, to those collisions that we remember talking about. So I'm not, it would have to be part of an overall strategy. I still would like to see us absolutely focused on China and choking off and encouraging the Chinese to choke everything off the North Koreans. Remember, they still have a very long land border with North Korea. They have an oil pipeline. And what we'd risk with a blockade is that we tie down our Pacific Fleet while the Chinese are still supplying the North Koreans, because to them, it's more of our problem than it is a Chinese problem.
Yeah, they've got to be made to feel like it is in their best interest to act in a way that is negative, has a negative impact on North Korea. By the way, North Korea, its state media outlet said this about the possibility of a naval blockade. They said, should the U.S. and its followers try to enforce the naval blockade against our country, we will see it as an act of war and respond with merciless self-defense countermeasures, as we have warned repeatedly. That sounds pretty much like the response we get to them from just about everything we do.
Yeah, well, that's right. But in this case, a blockade is considered, historically an act of war by most countries. The other piece here, though, is an authorities issue. We would need a UN sanction specifically authorizing the use of force. Right now, what the UN authorizes is an inspection regime, and that's fine, and we're starting to do that. We're certainly seeing the South Koreans do that. But if a ship doesn't comply, we are not authorized to actually use force to get it to comply. So we would have to go back to the UN for additional authorities. And again, what we would risk, at the end of the day, I think I would like to see us try a blockade before we go to the final military option. But we do risk also a slow escalation at sea, and we could risk losing the benefit of surprise by a precision strike on the nuclear program and on the leadership. So a lot for the president to consider here.
Yeah, you talked about China. We know Russia is also a factor here as well.
Absolutely.
How do those who believe North Korea is a threat to them, how do they convince China and Russia it's in their best interest to get involved in a more substantive way?
Well, what I think at the end of the day we have to do is make the Chinese, in particular, the Russians to a lesser degree, start feeling the pain and making this part of their problem. How would we do that? Well, one, we can authorize and work with the Japanese to go offensive. Their constitution right now prevents that in terms of their military. Reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons into South Korea, which we had up into the 1990s, and a number of other things in terms of introducing more advanced missile defense and more advanced radars, to the point where the Chinese see the security dynamic drastically shifting against them in Asia, and they say, you know what, North Korea, you're more of a problem than you're worth, and we're finally going to take drastic action here.
Yeah, we'll see. Every day a new twist in this. Michael Waltz, thank you so much for helping us break it down. Good to see you.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. Happy New Year.
You too.
Unilaterally, if the South Koreans are going through with talks with the North Koreans or further, inviting them to participate in the Olympic Games, Lindsey Graham, as I'm sure you're aware, Gordon, has said that that would be a big mistake, that the U.S. should not participate in the Games themselves if athletes from North Korea did. What do you think?
No, I don't think that we are at the point where we have to boycott. About the nuclear buttons always on his desk, that's saying to the United States, don't attack me. And I think that Kim Jong-un has actually become a little bit unnerved by some of the comments in Washington about a first strike on the North. Now, with regard to his comments to South Korea, these are really important because he's trying to divide, put a wedge between Seoul and
Kim Jong-un, who was saying over the weekend that nuclear button is always on his desk. But if these guys talk, then we're kind of in the odd position to wait them out. Let's talk to Nuclear Showdown bestselling author Gordon Chang on what happens now. Gordon, what do you think?
Well, Kim Jong-un is trying to do two things. First of all, with that comment.
All right, the Koreans, I'm talking about the North Koreans and the South Koreans trying to box the United States out. The South Korean leader looking forward to talk.
Washington, that's a long-term goal of the Kim regime. What he wants to do is to get the South Koreans to invest in North Korea, to give them aid, to drop sanctions, to do all the things which run counter to what President Trump is trying to do, which is to deny resources to Kim so he can't launch missiles or detonate nukes.
But then we can't do anything. Certainly